Joining me now is Democratic Representative from California, Karen Bass, and White House correspondent for American Urban Radio Networks, April Ryan. Thanks to you both for joining me.
Thanks for having us on.
So, Congresswoman, I'm going to start with you. Nelson Mandela, the communist. I mean, these guys just don't even know their history.
No, they don't, and it's actually, ignorance is very embarrassing. It's one of the reasons why our image on the continent had to be repaired after what our role was in the apartheid regime, and why we had to have a mass movement to pressure the U.S. government to break ties with the South African regime. Yeah. So it's an ignorant statement, and it's not surprising coming out of Bill O'Reilly.
Yeah, well, it's not. Hey, April, you know, interestingly enough, I just did a little bit of what I like to call Googling on my computer and did some research, and there was an organization, the International Freedom Foundation, which actually was started by South African authorities with the intention of essentially trying to convince people that the ANC was a communist organization and trying to improve the appearance of South Africa in the eyes of the West. We have found this quote from a senior South African military intelligence person who said, quote, "Our strategy was to paint the ANC as communist surrogates. The more we could present ourselves as anti-communist, the more people looked at us with respect. People you could have hardly believed cooperated with us politically when it came to the Soviets." I mean, April, I was able to find that in like 5 minutes online.
Yeah. Well, I want to put this in perspective. I talked to former President Bill Clinton yesterday, did an interview with him, and he said, you know, when it comes to this issue about Nelson Mandela and his friendships and those who supported him, like Gaddafi and Castro, he said one thing: we do not look at the world as others around the world look at themselves and view themselves. I remember when we went on the tour, the Africa, Historic Africa tour with Bill Clinton in his second term, and in Joburg, Nelson Mandela said he was asked a question about these friendships. And Nelson Mandela himself said, look, if you don't like my friendship, something to this effect, you can go jump in the pool. Yeah. So he stood, I mean, Nelson Mandela himself said this. Yep. And you have to remember, you know, that when people are different and they want to change an oppressive regime, injustice, they're called different names. They called Dr. King different names. They wanted to slander him. And you have to remember also, Karen, some of the reason why in recent times that they've called Nelson Mandela a communist is because he did not want to go, for the United States to go to war with Iraq.
That's
in Iraq. So, so the issue is many Americans here didn't want the war in Iraq either. So are we communists? So you know.
Well, be careful, April. You never, when it's Bill O'Reilly, you never know. He could be calling us communists any second. Congresswoman, you know, here's the other thing, though. I mean, I am so just tired, and I do mean weary tired of this comparison of the Affordable Care Act / Obamacare to all of these, you know, crazy things, and it's actually offensive. I mean, if you look at like the history of apartheid, again, you can find it in about 5 minutes on Google. We're talking about tactics where people were terrorized, they were waterboarded, people were removed from their homes at gunpoint and basically relocated hundreds of miles away in terrible conditions. There was forced segregation, and as you may remember, in 1976 we had the Soweto uprising, and at least 200 kids, these were basically high school kids, were killed. We're showing a picture now of the kinds of signs that were up everywhere. It reminds you, I guess, of Jim Crow, but to say that that is in any way, shape, or form like giving people access to health care?
Well, I mean, you know, again, it's another embarrassing statement. Actually, you know, the opposite was true, because the way I would look at it, the fight against apartheid was a fight for equal rights, for human rights. That's right. And in fact, it is in the South African Constitution that health care is a right. Our country is the country that has been behind for so long that we now provide health care to people. And so Santorum would say that providing health care is equal to apartheid. You know, it really is a statement of ignorance, and I think that it's very tragic. So he wants to go back to not providing health care to people with pre-existing conditions. He wants to go back to the conditions of the past, and I think it's a shameful comparison.
You know, April, as you mentioned, you had an interview yesterday with former President Bill Clinton. I wonder if you could share just quickly some other of his reflections of President Mandela, because obviously they had, I mean, a fairly close friendship.
They were very close. Yesterday when I talked to the former president, when he, as soon as he got on the phone, he said, you know, I said, I know. And you could hear it in his voice. And he talked about how the friendship was so deep. He said even in times when they disagreed politically, the friendship was still there. He said he would call and ask about how Hillary is doing, Hillary Clinton, how is Chelsea doing. He even wanted to get on the phone to talk to Chelsea to make sure that she was doing her homework at the time. So,
wow.
you know, yeah, and it was very interesting. But one of the takeaways I get from the interview was that this was a real friendship. I heard the emotion in former President Bill Clinton's voice, and I used it in the tape, but it was really touching. And to see this friendship bear out. I remember being in Africa during the historic Africa trip, and how former President Clinton at that time, he was then president, was helping Mandela down to the podium for the press conference, and how he revered him. And he was an icon. He's a world icon. These were two presidents together at the same time. So they had to deal with world issues at the same time, but also had a friendship. And that president in South Africa also helped this president learn how to deal with other people who hated him. The word forgiveness was very big for Bill Clinton, coming from Nelson Mandela.
You know, I will share with you briefly that that actually was a trip that I planned for President Clinton, so that moment was really quite special. But very quickly, Congresswoman Bass, as I understand it, you will have the opportunity to join a delegation that will be attending the services. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I'm very excited about that. We'll be leaving tomorrow, hopefully, if all goes well, with members of the House and Senate, especially members of the Congressional Black Caucus, and we'll all be going. And for me, it's really going to be an incredible moment. I never had the opportunity to meet President Mandela personally, but I was very involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and it shaped part of my upbringing as an activist. And being a little too young to have participated in the civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement was our opportunity to participate in that way.
That's so true. We have to leave it there. Congresswoman Karen Bass, safe travels. And April Ryan, thank you so much for being with me.